I never imagined the day would come when my own son, David, would turn his back on me while I was caring for my dying wife, Margaret. For decades I had raised him with love, guiding him through school, teaching him responsibility, and showing him the value of family. I thought our bond was unbreakable, but when he met his wife, Olivia, everything changed. Slowly, subtly, she convinced him that I was a burden, that my concerns were outdated, and that his loyalty should belong to her alone. I watched helplessly from Margaret's bedside as David's visits grew infrequent, his excuses more elaborate. At first I believed it was stress, work, fatigue, anything to rationalize his absence. But as days turned into weeks, I realized the truth. He had abandoned us, prioritizing Olivia over his dying mother and me. My heart ached with betrayal, but alongside the pain grew a quiet resolve. I knew that hurt alone would not bring justice or restore balance. I had to act carefully. While Margaret lay frail and fading, I began observing David and Olivia, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their arrogance. They believed they had won, that their manipulation had secured control over him, and through him, over our family. But I had not given up. I started by quietly securing what was left of our assets, accounts, property, and documents Margaret and I had protected for years. Every attempt they had made to influence him or take advantage of our vulnerability was being recorded. I even enlisted the help of an old family friend, George, someone I trusted implicitly, to watch their movements and report back. I pretended to be weak, exhausted, resigned to the situation, allowing them to believe their victory was complete. But every smile, every casual gesture, was a mask hiding the careful planning that had begun. I spent long nights at Margaret's bedside, not just tending to her, but reviewing every piece of evidence I had collected, organizing each detail meticulously. The more I observed, the more I understood their psychology, their overconfidence, their carelessness, and their sense of entitlement. These traits would become the very instruments of their downfall. I was patient, knowing that true revenge requires timing, precision, and subtlety. The plan I was formulating was not born of anger alone, but of justice, strategy, and a desire to restore the dignity my son and his wife had trampled. By pretending to be powerless, I allowed them to make mistakes, to reveal their true characters, and to underestimate me. Little did they know that beneath the frail exterior, a storm of calculated actions was building. A storm that would ultimately force David to confront his betrayal, and Olivia to recognize the cost of her manipulation. Margaret's weakening condition reminded me daily of the urgency, but also of the strength that comes from love, patience, and resilience. They believed they were in control, but the game had only just begun, and when the reckoning arrived, they would understand that betrayal against family carries a price far greater than they could ever imagine. After witnessing the betrayal, I knew subtlety and patience would be my greatest weapons. I could not confront David and Olivia directly yet. They were too confident, too arrogant to believe I posed any threat. Instead, I began laying the groundwork for a strategy that would expose them and restore balance. First, I secured every legal document, every account, and every piece of property that could be exploited. I worked quietly with Helen, a trusted lawyer, ensuring that nothing could be accessed without proper authorization. While David and Olivia assumed they had full control over our finances and household, they were unaware that every attempt to manipulate or access resources was being monitored. I also recruited George, an old family friend, to discreetly observe them and report their actions. George had known me for decades and understood the situation better than anyone else could. Next, I began documenting every interaction, every conversation, every misstep they made. Their arrogance made them careless. They assumed my illness and Margaret's condition had left me powerless, blind to their plotting. This false sense of security became my greatest advantage. I let them feel victorious, continue their schemes, and even boast about their small wins. Each move they made, each slip of the tongue, became evidence that would later serve my purpose. In the evenings, while Margaret rested, I reviewed their behaviors, noting patterns, weaknesses, and points of leverage. I realized that Olivia's influence over David was not absolute. His pride and desire for my approval could be used to create doubt and tension between them. Slowly, I began planting subtle hints, strategic reminders, and psychological nudges to make them second-guess each other and themselves. David, who once believed he was untouchable, started to show cracks in his confidence, questioning Olivia's decisions. Olivia, sensing a threat she could not identify, began to overcompensate, making errors in her attempts to control him and the household. I watched silently, knowing that the pressure would compound and their unity would fracture. Meanwhile, I maintained my role as the frail, vulnerable father, the figure they believed they could manipulate at will. Their arrogance blinded them to the careful traps I had set, the legal protections in place, and the evidence I had amassed. Every day, my resolve grew stronger. Margaret's condition reminded me of the limited time I had, fueling my determination to ensure that David and Olivia would fully understand the consequences of their betrayal. The plan was intricate, psychological, and precise, a series of calculated moves that would force them to face the truth, confront their guilt, and ultimately restore what they had taken for granted. As I sat in the quiet of my home each night, reviewing notes and planning the next step, I felt a calm certainty. Patience and strategy had placed me in the position of power. They believed they had abandoned me successfully, but in reality, their undoing had already begun. The reckoning was coming, and they would learn that no betrayal, however carefully plotted, goes unpunished. Weeks passed, and David and Olivia grew more complacent, believing they had successfully marginalized me and controlled the situation. Their arrogance was exactly what I needed. Every boast, every careless remark, every moment they assumed I was powerless only strengthened my resolve and provided more insight into their weaknesses. I decided it was time to initiate the first stage of my plan, a confrontation that would shatter their false confidence and remind them that betrayal carries consequences. I invited them to the house under the pretense of discussing minor matters concerning Margaret's care and the household. Their arrival was triumphant. David wore a smug grin, and Olivia's confidence radiated, both convinced they had won. I greeted them warmly, appearing fragile and subdued, and allowed them to believe that the victory was theirs. Then I began revealing evidence, small at first, so as to unsettle rather than overwhelm. Documents, emails, and bank statements that proved their attempts to manipulate me and control resources were laid out on the table. David's eyes flickered nervously, and Olivia's confident posture wavered as the reality began to sink in. I calmly explained that every attempt to take advantage of Margaret's condition, to circumvent legal protocols, and to exploit my perceived weakness had been anticipated and documented. Their disbelief and panic were immediate. Jessica might have been clever, but they were sloppy in their planning, leaving a trail I had quietly collected over weeks. Every whisper, every hidden transaction, every casual boast became proof of their deceit. I watched as their sense of unity began to fracture. Olivia looked to David for reassurance, but he could offer none. The truth was undeniable, and the trust between them started to crack under the weight of exposure. I spoke firmly, yet quietly, letting the words sink into their conscience. You believed illness and devotion to family could be exploited. You were wrong. Every move, every scheme, every attempt to control what was mine has failed. And now, you must face the consequences. Their reactions were raw. Desperation, fear, and shame flickered across their faces. I allowed them to leave after the meeting, letting the psychological impact settle in. The humiliation, the fear, and the awareness of exposure would grow over days, making them second-guess every interaction, every plan, and every choice. At night, I sat beside Margaret, comforting her, while reviewing every detail of the evidence I had presented. My plan was working. David and Olivia were no longer a unified front. Their confidence had been replaced by anxiety, and their arrogance was replaced by doubt. I had used patience, careful observation, and strategic action to turn the tables without a single overt act of confrontation. I reflected on the journey, knowing that this first stage was just the beginning. The ultimate reckoning, full restoration, of my dignity, secure protection of our assets, and a lesson in respect and consequence was still ahead. But already the fear and uncertainty in their eyes confirmed one undeniable truth. They had underestimated me, and their betrayal had set in motion a chain of events they could not control. The game had shifted, and I held the power. Every calculated step I had taken had positioned me to reclaim what was rightfully mine. And David and Olivia were now fully aware that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. The reckoning was approaching, and I would ensure it was both complete and unforgettable. After the first confrontation, David and Olivia were visibly shaken, but I knew the deeper impact of my plan would take time to manifest. Their arrogance had been broken, yet they continued to make small, careless attempts to regain control, believing they could still manipulate the situation. Each attempt was carefully observed and recorded, serving only to strengthen my position and expose their desperation. I began using psychological tactics to erode their confidence further. Subtle hints, seemingly innocent questions, and strategically misplaced documents made them question each other's loyalty and competence. David, who had once believed he could fully ignore my presence, now hesitated before making any decision. Olivia, sensing a threat she could not identify, started making mistakes, overreacting to small issues, and showing cracks in her once confident demeanor. Their unity began to crumble. Arguments erupted over trivial matters: who should speak with lawyers, who should handle finances, and who had made miscalculations. The duo who had previously acted as a united front was now divided, their alliance poisoned by suspicion and fear. I allowed this tension to grow, knowing that the psychological pressure would weaken them far more than any direct confrontation. At the same time, I continued securing our assets and reinforcing legal protections. Every account, property deed, and investment was monitored and safeguarded, leaving them powerless to seize what they had believed was theirs. They were unaware that every attempt to maneuver behind my back was documented, creating an indisputable record of their deceit. I observed quietly as they tried to regain dominance, but their efforts only highlighted their desperation and incompetence. One evening I orchestrated a subtle but decisive move. I invited them again under the pretense of a family discussion about remaining matters related to Margaret's care. They arrived cautiously, hoping to negotiate some semblance of control, but I had prepared a more comprehensive revelation. I presented new evidence of their attempts to bypass legal measures, including unauthorized financial inquiries, forged signatures, and clandestine meetings. Their faces drained of color as the truth became undeniable. Panic replaced arrogance, and their attempts at rationalization fell apart under the weight of incontrovertible proof. I spoke calmly but firmly, reminding them that their mother-in-law's illness and my age did not equate to weakness, and that their greed had blinded them to the consequences of betrayal. Tears filled Olivia's eyes, and David's confident demeanor shattered completely. They began to understand that their attempts to control me had failed at every level, and the very bonds they relied upon, trust, loyalty, and family, were now fractured irreparably. I let them leave that evening, allowing the humiliation and realization to take root. Over the following days, I continued to monitor their actions, observing how suspicion and anxiety poisoned every interaction between them. They second-guessed decisions, accused each other of errors, and grew increasingly isolated in their shared failure. Meanwhile, I maintained my outwardly frail and exhausted persona, ensuring they continued to underestimate my resolve and strategy. Their downfall was not driven solely by my confrontation, but by the careful combination of legal safeguards, psychological manipulation, and patience that left them vulnerable to their own flaws. The lesson was becoming clear. Betrayal carries consequences, and greed and arrogance only hasten one's defeat. In the quiet of my home, beside Margaret, I reflected on the progress. David and Olivia were unraveling, not through anger or confrontation, but through the realization of their own errors and the weight of undeniable truth. The first wave of their reckoning was complete, and the foundation for final justice in restoring dignity, reclaiming control, and teaching an unforgettable lesson had been firmly established. The next stage would seal their fate completely, leaving no doubt that underestimating a parent's patience and intelligence is a mistake with irreversible consequences. The following weeks marked the escalation of my plan. David and Olivia, still reeling from the previous confrontations, were now visibly anxious and unsure of themselves. I allowed them to think they were slowly regaining control, all the while observing every action and response. My focus was on reclaiming what they had tried to take, not only the material wealth but also the respect and authority they had stripped from me. I reinforced the legal safeguards surrounding our properties and accounts. Each investment they believed they could manipulate was now untouchable, fully documented, and protected under law. Every email, every call, and every attempt to access finances became additional proof of their betrayal, ready to be used against them if necessary. Beyond legal measures, I intensified the psychological pressure. I created scenarios that forced them to question each other's loyalty and judgment. David began doubting Olivia's decisions, while Olivia questioned David's competence. Their once unified front crumbled further, and small arguments erupted over seemingly trivial matters, decisions about household management, finances, and Margaret's care. Each confrontation, each slip, strengthened my position and confirmed that the psychological manipulation was effective. I continued to play the role of the frail, exhausted father, careful not to reveal my strategy. Their overconfidence remained their undoing. I invited them to the house again under the guise of a family discussion, allowing them to believe they might negotiate a compromise. This time, I presented the full scope of their failed attempts, including recent unauthorized actions and hidden schemes. Their shock was immediate. David's confident demeanor collapsed and Olivia's bravado faltered as they realized that every action had been anticipated and recorded. I spoke clearly, letting the weight of my words sink in. You believed that illness and absence meant weakness. You thought my love and trust could be exploited. But every move you made has been observed and countered. And now, you must face the consequences. Their pleas were frantic, but I remained calm, reinforcing their understanding that their actions had irreversibly damaged trust and family bonds. Over the following days, I allowed them to feel the full weight of their mistakes. Anxiety and suspicion consumed them, and their attempts to regain dominance only highlighted their incompetence. I let them experience the consequences of betrayal, fully, ensuring the lesson was deeply internalized. Meanwhile, Margaret's health, though fragile, served as a reminder of the urgency and importance of justice. I spent quiet moments by her side, reflecting on the progress and preparing for the final phase of my plan. Reclaiming control was not just about wealth. It was about restoring dignity, teaching a powerful lesson, and ensuring that David and Olivia understood the gravity of their betrayal. With patience, careful planning, and unwavering resolve, I had turned their greed and arrogance against them, positioning myself to deliver the ultimate reckoning. The stage was set for the final confrontation, one that would leave them humbled, regretful, and forever aware of the consequences of betraying a parent. The path of revenge had been long and calculated, and now the culmination of years of patience and strategy was within reach. The day of the final reckoning arrived, and David and Olivia were unaware of how meticulously everything had been planned. They believed that the previous confrontations were minor setbacks, that their arrogance had only been slightly bruised, and that they could still regain some semblance of control. I invited them once more under the pretense of discussing Margaret's remaining personal matters, presenting myself as frail and exhausted, the picture of a father beaten by circumstance. They arrived cautiously, their confidence fragile but still lingering, unaware that they were walking directly into the culmination of my strategy. I laid out every piece of evidence I had amassed: unauthorized bank inquiries, forged signatures, secret meetings, and deceitful conversations, along with documentation of their careless attempts to manipulate me and control the household. The shock on their faces was immediate. Olivia's proud posture crumbled, and David's attempts to justify himself faltered under the weight of undeniable truth. I spoke calmly, but with unwavering authority, making it clear that every attempt they had made to betray their family had been anticipated, recorded, and legally secured. I reminded them that wealth was not the only thing at stake. It was trust, respect, and the sanctity of family bonds they had shattered. Their pleas were frantic, their excuses feeble, and their arrogance completely dismantled. The fractures between them widened visibly as suspicion and fear took root. David questioned Olivia's judgment, and Olivia accused David of carelessness, their once unified front now destroyed by tension and doubt. I allowed them to experience the full impact of their betrayal, not only through loss of control over finances and property, but also through the psychological realization that they had overstepped in the most unforgivable way, betraying their own father during his darkest time. As they left my home, humiliated, anxious, and humbled, I felt a profound sense of justice. The wealth was secure, Margaret's dignity preserved, and the lesson had been delivered. My patience, planning, and careful observation had ensured that David and Olivia understood the cost of greed, arrogance, and betrayal. Finally, in the quiet of my home, I could sit beside Margaret and reflect on the journey. The reckoning was complete, and I had restored both my dignity and my family's legacy. They had underestimated me, and now the consequences of their choices would remain a permanent mark on their lives.